For centuries, Judas Iscariot has been portrayed as the greatest villain in Christian history, the traitor who handed Jesus over for a few pieces of silver. His image has been immortalized as the ultimate symbol of betrayal, condemned both on earth and, according to some, in hell. But what if we discovered that Judas was not the traitor we imagined? What if he had been chosen for a deeper, more spiritual role, not as a mere instrument of evil, but as an essential part of a divine plan? The Gospel of Judas, one of the Gnostic texts discovered in the 20th century, completely reverses this narrative. In it, Judas not only acts with Jesus' consent, but is depicted as the most enlightened disciple, the only one who understood his master's true mission. This revelation raises an intriguing question. Why would the church suppress a text that portrays Judas as the hero? The discovery of the Gospel of Judas in the late 20th century brought a shocking shift in perspective for those who grew up with the traditional Christian view of Judas Iscariot. For nearly 2,000 years, Judas was regarded as the ultimate traitor, the symbol of disloyalty and greed, remembered as the man who handed Jesus Christ over to the Jewish leaders for 30 pieces of silver. However, the Gnostic text, dating back to the 2nd or 3rd century after Christ, profoundly challenges this narrative, presenting Judas not as the villain of the story, but as Jesus' most intimate and faithful disciple, the one who understood the true nature of his divine mission. The traditional version, found in the canonical Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, describes Judas as a traitor driven by ambition and money. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verses 14 to 16, details Judas's agreement with the priests, where he accepts 30 pieces of silver to betray Jesus. In this version, Judas personifies human error, someone who places worldly interests above his spiritual duty. But in the Gospel of Judas, his action is not motivated by betrayal, but by the execution of a greater plan, orchestrated by Jesus himself, in which Judas fulfills an essential role. In the Gnostic context, the material world is seen as a prison created by a lower god, known as the Demiurge, who traps souls in physical bodies. For Gnostics, salvation does not come through obedience to religious laws or sacrifices, but through spiritual knowledge or gnosis. This knowledge is the path to liberating the soul from the material prison, allowing it to return to its divine origin. Within this framework, Jesus is seen as a celestial being who descended into the material world to share this knowledge. And Judas, far from being a traitor, is the only disciple who truly understands this mission. In the Gospel of Judas, there is a complete reversal of the role Judas plays in the passion story of Christ. Instead of being the one who betrayed Jesus, he is depicted as the only one who understood the necessity for Jesus to be freed from his physical body so that his true spiritual nature could be revealed. In a key passage, Jesus says to Judas, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me," suggesting that Jesus' physical body was a temporary prison for his divine essence. By handing Jesus over to death, Judas would, in fact, be helping to liberate this divine essence. This revelation completely subverts the idea of betrayal, transforming Judas into the agent of Christ's liberation, not his executioner. The relationship between Judas and Jesus in this gospel is radically different from that portrayed in the canonical Gospels. Jesus entrusts Judas with secrets that the other disciples are unable to understand. At several points in the text, Jesus mocks the other apostles, suggesting that their devotion to the Demiurge, the creator god of the material world, prevents them from grasping the true nature of his ministry. Judas, on the other hand, is chosen to receive the deepest knowledge, one that challenges traditional narratives of good and evil, sin and redemption. In Gnosticism, the Demiurge is depicted as a flawed creator, an arrogant being who imprisoned human souls in material bodies and who prevents their liberation. This view sharply contrasts with Orthodox Christian theology, which sees the God of the Old Testament as the benevolent and omnipotent creator of all things. However, for the Gnostics, this God is not the true God. The true God is a transcendent entity, inaccessible and completely separate from the material creation. Jesus, then, is an emissary of this transcendent God, sent to free human souls from the prison imposed by the Demiurge. Within this vision, Judas's role takes on cosmic importance. His betrayal is not betrayal in the traditional sense, but an act of obedience to divine will. He is, in a sense, the only one spiritually awake enough to carry out the task Jesus entrusted to him, delivering Jesus' physical body to death so that his soul could return to the spiritual realm. This vision subverts the idea of Judas as the ultimate traitor, suggesting instead that he was the most faithful disciple, the one who understood Jesus' greater plan and helped fulfill it. This approach to Judas's betrayal is not unique in Gnosticism. There are clear parallels with other spiritual and mythological traditions that view acts of transgression as necessary for spiritual evolution or cosmic transformation. A clear example is the myth of Prometheus, who defied the gods by stealing fire and giving it to humanity. Though punished for his transgression, Prometheus is seen, in many interpretations, as a hero, someone who brought knowledge and light to mankind. Similarly, Judas, by betraying Jesus, is not committing a sin, but rather fulfilling a necessary role in the Messiah's spiritual liberation. Moreover, the concept of sacrifice is also profoundly reimagined in the Gospel of Judas. In the canonical Gospels, Jesus' sacrifice is one of atonement, where he dies for the sins of humanity. In Gnosticism, however, Jesus' death is seen differently. He is not dying for humanity's sins, but to free his soul from the prison of the material body. Jesus' sacrifice is thus a personal liberation, and Judas is the facilitator of that sacrifice. He is the agent who makes this liberation possible, and for this reason, his role is crucial. Judas's role in this gospel also raises questions about the legitimacy of ecclesiastical authority, especially concerning apostolic succession. In the canonical Gospels, Peter is chosen by Jesus as the leader of the apostles and the rock upon which the church would be built, Matthew 16:18. However, in the Gospel of Judas, Peter and the other apostles are portrayed as misunderstanding and ignorant of Jesus' true plan. Judas, on the other hand, is the one who receives the true knowledge. This raises the question, if Judas was the closest and most enlightened disciple, what does this mean for the legitimacy of the church, which was built on the authority of Peter and the other apostles? Besides questioning ecclesiastical authority, the Gospel of Judas invites us to reconsider the concept of heresy. The word heresy comes from the Greek hieresis, meaning choice or option. Throughout the first centuries of Christianity, many competing views about Jesus and his teachings were labeled as heretical because they diverged from the doctrine that would become dominant. However, the Gospel of Judas reminds us that history is shaped by the victors, and many suppressed voices, such as Judas's in this text, offer rich and complex spiritual perspectives that challenge orthodox narratives. This reinterpretation of Judas forces us to reflect on how tradition has shaped our understanding of his actions. Could it be that Judas, considered the greatest villain in Christian history, was actually the most faithful disciple, the one who understood Jesus' true purpose and acted in accordance with that understanding? And if so, how does this change our understanding of Jesus and his mission? These questions invite us to delve deeper into the complexities of early Christianity and the alternative narratives that have been suppressed for centuries. The exclusion of the Gospel of Judas from the biblical canon was the result of a series of theological, political, and social factors that shaped Christianity in the first centuries after Christ. To understand this exclusion, we need to return to the historical context of the time when Christianity was still in formation, and different factions were competing to define what would become the true doctrine. Among these factions, Gnosticism stood out as a particularly influential and at the same time controversial movement. Gnosticism was one of the many movements within early Christianity, characterized by a profoundly dualistic view of the universe. For the Gnostics, the material world was a corrupted and imperfect creation, ruled by a lesser god, the demiurge, who trapped human souls in the flesh. The true God was a transcendent and ineffable entity, whose essence was beyond common human understanding. For the Gnostics, salvation did not come through faith or the sacraments of the church, but through gnosis, a secret and esoteric knowledge that liberated the soul from the cycle of reincarnation and suffering. The Gospel of Judas deeply reflects this Gnostic worldview. In the text, Jesus reveals secrets about the cosmos, the divine nature, and humanity's destiny to Judas, secrets that are denied to the other apostles. Judas, in turn, is not seen as a traitor, but as the only disciple capable of understanding Jesus' true plan. He is chosen to play a crucial role in liberating Jesus from the prison of the physical body, facilitating his death so that he can return to the spiritual realm. This radically different view of the traditional narrative of Jesus' betrayal and crucifixion was deeply threatening to the emerging church. During the first centuries after Christ, the church was in the process of consolidating its doctrine and authority. Texts like the Gospel of Judas, which presented alternative and often subversive interpretations of Jesus' teachings were seen as a threat to the unity of Christian faith. The exclusion of the Gospel of Judas and other Gnostic texts reflects a deliberate effort by the Church to consolidate what was considered orthodox teachings, separating them from those labeled as heretical. This process culminated in councils and synods, where church leaders decided which texts would form the canon of the New Testament. Among these councils, the Council of Nicaea, held in 325 after Christ, was one of the most important. Convened by Emperor Constantine, the council aimed to resolve theological disputes and unify the Church under a single doctrine. However, the exclusion of the Gospel of Judas and other Gnostic texts was not solely a theological decision. There was also a strong political component involved. The nascent Church was trying to establish itself as the dominant spiritual authority, and this required suppressing dissenting views. Texts like the Gospel of Judas, which challenged the authority of the apostles and presented an alternative view of Jesus, were seen as a threat to the Church's legitimacy. Irenaeus of Lyon, one of the most influential Christian theologians of the 2nd century, played a central role in condemning Gnostic Gospels. In his work against heresies, written around 180 after Christ, he accused the Gnostics of distorting Jesus' teachings and spreading heresies that threatened the Christian faith. He reserved particularly harsh criticism for the Gospel of Judas, which he saw as a threat to the structure of Christian belief. For Irenaeus and other church leaders, Gnosticism represented not just a different theological view, but a direct threat to the Church's authority and unity. Additionally, the exclusion of the Gospel of Judas was also tied to the Church's view on apostolic succession. The Catholic Church based its legitimacy on the succession of the apostles, particularly Peter, who, according to the Gospel of Matthew 16:18, had been named by Jesus as the rock upon which the Church would be built. The Gospel of Judas, however, presented a completely different view. In this text, Peter and the other apostles are portrayed as ignorant of Jesus' true plan, while Judas is the only one who understands the truth. If the Gospel of Judas were accepted, it would call into question the legitimacy of the Church and its apostolic succession. Another important aspect is the Gnostic cosmology presented in the Gospel of Judas. The text reveals a vision of the cosmos where the material world is ruled by evil forces, the archons, who are responsible for keeping souls trapped in matter. This vision starkly contrasted with Orthodox Christian doctrine, which viewed creation as good and the God of the Old Testament as the benevolent creator of all things. For the Gnostics, the creator God of the Old Testament was, in fact, the demiurge, an imperfect and arrogant being who believed himself to be the only God. This Gnostic vision of the cosmos threatened the central doctrine of the Church regarding the goodness of creation and the unity of God. If the material world was indeed a prison created by a lesser God, as the Gnostics believed, then the very structure of traditional Christian theology would be at risk. The exclusion of the Gospel of Judas and other Gnostic texts was partly an attempt to protect this doctrine and preserve the Church's authority. The exclusion of Gnostic texts culminated in their systematic destruction. Many of these texts were burned or lost over the centuries, and only fragments survived. The Gospel of Judas, for example, disappeared for almost 2,000 years, until it was rediscovered in a cave in Egypt in the 1970s. Its rediscovery raised questions about the nature of heresy and how alternative narratives were suppressed throughout history. In the end, the exclusion of the Gospel of Judas from the Bible was not just a matter of doctrine. It was a deeply political and cultural decision, part of a larger effort to unify Christianity under a single narrative and suppress dissenting views. The story of the Gospel of Judas reminds us that early Christianity was far more diverse and complex than the official version that eventually prevailed. Numbers have always played a fundamental role in various spiritual and esoteric traditions, and the Gospel of Judas is no exception. In this Gnostic text, the number 13 emerges as a powerful symbol filled with hidden meanings, linked both to Gnostic cosmology and to Judas's role as the chosen disciple. More than just being the 13th disciple of Jesus, Judas takes on a transcendental and transformative position that sets him apart from the understanding of the other apostles. In many cultures and traditions, the number 12 is associated with order, perfection, and a complete cycle. For instance, there are the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 zodiac signs, the 12 apostles, and even the 12 months of the year, all representing divine balance and structural harmony in the cosmos. The number 13, on the other hand, is often seen as a number of disruption, transgression, and transformation. It breaks this established harmony, symbolizing the transition to a new phase, a moment of crisis, death, and rebirth. In the Gospel of Judas, Judas's role as the 13th apostle is imbued with this symbolism. He stands outside the perfection of the circle of 12, both separated from and spiritually above them in understanding. Judas is not merely a traitor. He transcends the earthly limitations of his companions. He understands that Jesus' true purpose is not to remain in the material world, but to free himself from it, to ascend to the divine realm, and begin a new phase in the cosmic cycle. By handing Jesus over, Judas fulfills the role of the agent of this transformation, symbolized by the number 13. This symbolism is especially evident when we view the number 13 through the lens of Gnostic tradition. In Gnosticism, the physical world is seen as imperfect, a corrupted creation of the demiurge, the lower god who traps human souls in matter. Gnostics believe that a number of aeons, divine emanations, formed the pleroma, or divine fullness. Traditionally, these aeons were grouped in sets of 12, representing divine order. But there was always a 13th aeon, a figure that transcends this order and represents the break from the material cycle. In the case of Judas, he is associated with this 13th aeon. Not only does he stand apart from the other apostles, but he also transcends their understanding of Jesus' mission. The other disciples are trapped in a misguided worship of the demiurge, while Judas is the one who receives Jesus' hidden knowledge as the true emissary of the supreme divinity. His betrayal is therefore not a betrayal of Jesus' spiritual purpose, but the beginning of a cycle of liberation and transformation, which explains the cosmic role of the number 13. This symbolism of 13 as a number of transgression and rebirth can be found in many other esoteric traditions. In Tarot, the number 13 corresponds to the death card, which does not represent an end, but a necessary change, a transition to a new phase of existence. The cycle of life and death is depicted not as a termination, but as a transformation. Similarly, Jesus' death in the Gospel of Judas is not the end, but the liberation of his divine essence from the prison of the physical body. By committing this betrayal, Judas facilitates this transition. He is not ending the cycle, but initiating a new one. Moreover, in the context of Kabbalah, the number 13 holds deep significance. In the Tree of Life, which symbolizes the path to spiritual enlightenment, the number 13 is associated with divine unity between the masculine and feminine, between the human and the divine, and between matter and spirit. This suggests that Judas, as the 13th, is the point of connection between humanity and the divine, the agent who enables Jesus' spiritual ascension, and by extension, the redemption of souls trapped in the material world. This concept also echoes in mythological traditions. In Greek mythology, the god Dionysus, often associated with the number 13, is the god of transformation, madness, and the transcendence of human limits. Dionysus, like Judas, is a figure who breaks with conventions and brings new order to chaos. His death and rebirth are symbolic representations of the destruction of established order and the ascension to a new reality. Thus, Judas's role in the Gospel of Judas as the 13th is charged with esoteric symbolism. He is not the traitor who destroys, but the agent of transformation, the one who breaks earthly order and enables Jesus' ascension to the spiritual realm. The number 13, far from being a symbol of bad luck, is the number of cosmic transition, of the death of the old and the birth of the new. Furthermore, the number 13 is often feared in various cultures for this very reason, its connection to death and transformation. In traditional Christianity, the Last Supper is often remembered as a moment where 13 people were present, and Judas is seen as responsible for bringing about Jesus' death. But from a Gnostic perspective, this number is not feared. On the contrary, it is celebrated as the number that symbolizes the necessary passage, the sacrifice that liberates. The Last Supper, as narrated in the canonical Gospels, is one of the most well-known scenes in the life of Jesus. It is a moment of communion between Jesus and his disciples, where he institutes the Eucharist, symbolically offering his body and blood through bread and wine. However, within the context of the Gospel of Judas, this supper takes on a much deeper and esoteric meaning, an occult initiation ritual where Judas stands out as the true initiate. In the canonical Gospels, the Last Supper is depicted as an event where Jesus shares a meal with his disciples before his arrest. This moment symbolizes both Jesus' farewell and the establishment of one of Christianity's central rituals, the Eucharist, in which bread and wine represent Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. But in the Gospel of Judas, this supper is much more than a mere symbolic meal. It can be viewed as a spiritual rite of passage, a moment when Judas is chosen to receive the hidden knowledge that will make him the agent of Jesus' liberation. The idea of an esoteric meal or spiritual banquet is central to many mystical and religious traditions. In Gnosticism, physical food is often seen as a metaphor for spiritual knowledge, which must be consumed by the initiate to achieve enlightenment. The Gospel of Judas suggests that while the other disciples participated in a physical meal, Judas was partaking in a spiritual feast, absorbing gnosis, the secret knowledge that would prepare him for his mission. This interpretation of the Last Supper as an initiation rite aligns with the esoteric practices of various ancient traditions. In the Eleusinian mysteries of ancient Greece, initiates participated in a sacred banquet that represented communion with the gods and preparation for a new stage of consciousness. Something similar is suggested in the Gospel of Judas, where Judas is being prepared to understand Jesus' true mission and his own role in the divine plan. The gnosis that Jesus transmits to Judas during this spiritual banquet is the knowledge about the true nature of God, the cosmos, and Jesus' role as a spiritual liberator. In Gnosticism, this gnosis is the path to salvation, not faith or external rituals. While the other disciples remain trapped in the worship of the demiurge, Judas receives the knowledge necessary to understand that Jesus' death will not be a defeat, but a liberation. This view of the Last Supper as a moment of esoteric revelation upends the traditional narrative of Judas's betrayal. In Orthodox Christianity, Judas is seen as the traitor who, after the supper, delivers Jesus to the religious leaders. However, in the Gospel of Judas, this betrayal is a necessary part of Jesus' plan. Judas is fulfilling his role not as a traitor, but as the one who will free Jesus from his physical imprisonment. He is the only disciple who understands that Jesus' death is not an end, but the beginning of his ascension. The idea of a spiritual meal also appears in other Gnostic texts. In the Gospel of Thomas, for example, Jesus says, "He who drinks from my mouth will become like me." This phrase suggests that true communion with Jesus comes not through bread and wine, but through absorbing spiritual knowledge. In the Gospel of Judas, Judas is the one who drinks from the mouth of Jesus, receiving the hidden knowledge that prepares him for his mission. In Orthodox Christianity, the Eucharist is one of the most important sacraments, symbolizing participation in the death and resurrection of Jesus. But in the Gnostic context, the true communion is communion with spiritual knowledge, not with the physical body and blood of Jesus. The Last Supper, in the Gospel of Judas, is less of a physical ritual and more of a moment of spiritual revelation, where Judas becomes the only disciple capable of understanding Jesus' true mission. This distinction between external ritual and internal knowledge is a central feature of Gnosticism. For Gnostics, physical rituals, such as baptism or the Eucharist, are merely external symbols that, without spiritual knowledge, are empty. True salvation can only be attained through gnosis, the secret knowledge that frees the soul from the prison of the body. And it is this knowledge that Jesus transmits to Judas at the Last Supper. This esoteric view of the supper also raises questions about Judas's role. If Judas was the only disciple who understood Jesus' true plan, does that mean his betrayal was really a betrayal? Or should it be interpreted as a gesture of spiritual obedience, a necessary part of Jesus' liberation from the material world? In the Gnostic context, Judas's betrayal is not a mistake, but a conscious and necessary action for Jesus' salvation. The Last Supper, therefore, can be seen not just as a farewell meal, but as an initiation rite, where Judas is chosen to receive the hidden knowledge that prepares him for his mission. He is not the ignorant traitor portrayed in the canonical Gospels, but the true initiate, the one who understands what is about to happen and acts according to this knowledge. Ultimately, the Gospel of Judas offers a profoundly different view of the Last Supper. It is not just a ritual of communion with Jesus' physical body, but a moment of spiritual communion, where Judas is initiated into the mysteries of the kingdom and becomes the agent of Jesus' liberation. This understanding of the supper as an esoteric ritual invites us to reconsider Judas's role and his betrayal not as an error, but as a necessary step in Jesus' spiritual journey. The concept of the traitor in Christianity, personified by Judas Iscariot, is one of the most deeply rooted notions in theology and Western culture. From early biblical accounts to medieval and modern literature, Judas is the archetype of the traitor, the one who sold his master for 30 pieces of silver, thus condemned to eternal torment. However, when we take a closer look, especially through the lens of the Gospel of Judas. This concept reveals itself to be much more complex, with profound connections to the occult and esoteric traditions. Historically, Judas was demonized as the ultimate traitor for handing Jesus over to the religious leaders, leading directly to his crucifixion. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verses 14 to 16, details Judas's agreement with the priests, who agreed to pay him 30 pieces of silver in exchange for his betrayal. This act of selling Jesus became the ultimate symbol of greed and disloyalty, and Judas was condemned as the worst of sinners. But the Gospel of Judas offers an alternative narrative, where Judas's betrayal is not an act of evil, but part of a greater, divine plan. In Orthodox Christianity, the concept of betrayal is closely tied to the idea of sin and the fall. Judas is seen as the man who, by betraying Jesus, committed the ultimate sin, a sin that led to his destruction. But in esoteric traditions, the idea of betrayal or transgression takes on a different meaning. Often, betrayal is seen not as an act of evil, but as a form of spiritual transcendence, a necessary rupture with established rules to achieve a deeper truth. This is especially evident in Gnosticism, where the transgression of the material world's laws is often seen as a necessary step towards enlightenment. In the Gospel of Judas, this transgression takes on a divine form. By betraying Jesus, Judas is not violating God's will, but fulfilling it. He is the only disciple who understands that Jesus' death is an essential part of the salvation plan, not a failure. He realizes that Jesus' body is a prison that must be destroyed, so that his divine soul can return to the spiritual realm. In this sense, Judas is not a traitor but a facilitator of salvation. This view of betrayal as a means of transcendence is reflected in many esoteric traditions. In Greek mythology, for example, the Titan Prometheus is often seen as a traitor to the gods for stealing fire and giving it to humanity. However, far from being a villain, Prometheus is considered a hero, someone who brought knowledge and light to the world. His act of betrayal is, in fact, an act of enlightenment, a gesture that elevates humanity and challenges divine power in the name of spiritual progress. Similarly, in the Gospel of Judas, Judas is not a villain, but someone who, by betraying Jesus, is bringing true liberation. He understands that Jesus' death is necessary for him to ascend to the divine realm and fulfill his destiny. This betrayal is a gesture of spiritual obedience, not disloyalty. Judas is the Prometheus of Gnostic Christianity, someone who challenges conventions to bring about a deeper truth. This reinterpretation of betrayal leads us to question the very concept of sin and evil in Christianity. If Judas was truly following the divine plan, could he be considered a sinner? Or is the real sin the ignorance of the other apostles, who did not understand Jesus' true purpose? In Gnosticism, ignorance is seen as the greatest sin because it is what keeps souls trapped in the material world. Judas, unlike the other disciples, possesses the knowledge, gnosis, and is therefore not bound by the cycle of sin. This view of Judas as an enlightened transgressor also parallels the figure of Lucifer, the light bringer, in Christian tradition. While Lucifer is traditionally seen as the greatest traitor, the one who challenged God and was cast out of heaven, some esoteric interpretations see him as a symbol of knowledge and rebellion against ignorance. Like Judas, Lucifer represents the figure who challenges the established order in the name of a deeper truth, even though this act condemns him to perdition. In Orthodox Christianity, Judas is often compared to Lucifer, both described as the greatest traitors in sacred history. But in Gnosticism, the story is more complex. Judas, like Lucifer, is the bearer of a truth that others cannot understand. His betrayal is not an act of evil, but of revelation. He is freeing Jesus from the prison of the body, just as Lucifer brought knowledge to humanity by challenging them to question divine order. The relationship between Judas and the occult can also be seen in alchemical traditions. In alchemy, the process of transmutation involves the destruction of base matter so that it can be purified and transformed into something superior. Similarly, Judas destroys Jesus' physical body, the base matter, so that his divine soul can be purified and ascend to the spiritual realm. This process of destruction and creation, of betrayal and redemption, is central to the Gnostic view of Judas's role. Ultimately, the concept of traitor in Christianity, especially in the context of the Gospel of Judas, invites us to rethink our understanding of sin, transgression, and knowledge. Far from being a simple villain, Judas is a complex figure, a transgressor illuminated by gnosis, fulfilling a crucial role in the divine plan. His betrayal is actually an act of liberation, a necessary step in Jesus' ascension and the realization of his cosmic mission. If Judas's betrayal was necessary for Jesus' spiritual liberation, to what extent can we consider the concept of betrayal an absolute sin? Or could it be a path to hidden truth? The Gospel of Judas offers a completely new perspective on Judas Iscariot, transforming him from traitor to facilitator of Jesus' spiritual liberation. Rather than a villain motivated by greed, he is portrayed as the most enlightened disciple, able to understand Jesus' true plan, and therefore chosen to fulfill the most crucial role in the divine mission. This reinterpretation challenges traditional Christian narratives and raises profound questions about how history has been shaped, particularly regarding the suppression of texts like this that offered alternative and complex views of faith. The fact that the Gospel of Judas was suppressed for centuries reminds us of the power that religious institutions held to define what would be considered orthodox and what would be labeled as heresy. As we rediscover texts like this, we are invited to reconsider our understanding of Christianity's central figures and to explore the multiple forms of spirituality that were marginalized over time. Far from being a traitor, Judas emerges as a central figure whose role in Jesus' liberation is essential to the story of salvation. If you're interested in exploring more about spirituality, I have specially selected some videos filled with deep insights and fascinating discoveries that you'll love. Just click on one of them. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue this journey of self-discovery and spiritual learning. Your commitment to knowledge is the first step towards transforming your reality.